I want to specifically talk about transparency, whether what is required by the Act, of course, in relation to statements needed to be made, and whether just simple compliance with that is going to be enough, or whether there's really a more wider trend towards human rights and having wider policies in relation to that. Just to remind you, modern slavery, we've heard a lot about forced labour, bonded labour, but just to remind yourselves of the definition within the Act: slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labour, and of course human trafficking is all encompassed within this. The part which it will affect you all, at least those of you with a turnover of 36 million or more, is going to be the need to make a statement with regard to what you're doing each financial year with regard to combating this problem within your supply chain. It should be remembered this doesn't just apply to goods. What I'm seeing in practice is that a lot of organisations are looking at just the goods aspect of this, supplying a widget, for instance, rather than the services that they're getting. And I think that is something which needs to be something which you have in mind. There is, of course, a lot of statutory guidance out there. The guidance in relation to the statement really only tells you in broadest terms what it should do. It's not a prescriptive thing, and of course can change from business to business. There is also another bill, and within this House, I'm not sure whether we know quite whether or not this is likely to come into force, whether it's likely to be adopted by the government, which would extend this requirement from the commercial, from private and commercial businesses into the public sector. And if that does happen and goes through as it's currently drafted, then it would have more teeth in relation to the construction industry, simply because it would exclude those who do not provide a statement from procurement procedures in the public sector. So it's something worth keeping an eye on from your business. It's received a second reading. I think it's unlikely to get on the statute book without government support. However, having said that, of course, government support for this comes from the very top. It was, after all, Mrs. May that introduced all this in the first place, and so watch this space. A lot of organisations are dealing with the compliance angle. I think what ought to be looked at now is whether you ought to be thinking about wider human rights. A lot of larger organisations are already signed up to the UN Global Compact, for instance, and the guiding principles. Our current legislation already requires us to, in certain companies, quoted companies, to report within their annual returns and their strategic reports human rights issues, as the law says, where necessary, which is a bit wishy-washy, I'm afraid, for the understanding of development and performance of the business. Things may well move on from that as a result of the non-financial reporting directive, which is due to come in, and despite Brexit, it will still come in, and we will still be bound by it, at least for the foreseeable future. And that is due to be coming in very shortly. The UK is supposed to transpose the provisions of that directive into law by the 6th of December. The response to the consultation was published 2 days ago by the government, saying that they will be bringing in legislation in relation to this, and that is something which is worth keeping an eye on. It won't cover all of you, but it will cover what are known as public interest entities. There was some debate as to whether the UK would go further in relation to the nature of the entities that would be caught by this, but that's been decided against on the basis that we don't want to gold plate the directive. But there will be regulations, and I would suggest you keep an eye on what's precisely going to be required by those. They will have to issue relatively shortly to meet that date. I've given there some countries which have already published implementing measures. So there are other countries in Europe that are beginning to do this: Estonia, Greece, Luxembourg, others I've mentioned there. And we are seeing, as was said, in Asia and so on, in Singapore and Malaysian and Hong Kong listed companies are being required now to report in a similar way for financial years after next year. So this is a trend which the UK has been leading the way in, and it's something to become aware of. And it's then a question, I think, of whether you go and just say, do I go for bare compliance with the Section 54 statement, or do I look at going for a much rounder human rights policy in all sorts of other areas? And if this new directive will require companies to set out not only what they're doing in relation to these social and employee matters, which would include this area, but include things like health and safety, environment, anti-corruption and bribery, which we already mentioned, which is in a lot of ways closely linked to this area. And of course we will, and there will in due course be a UK Bill of Rights as we understand it. So how that's going to impact with this is something again to be aware of going forward. What are others doing? I was asked to say a bit about what others were doing around the world. The only other legislation is in California, and that is at least in relation to transparency, in relation to the requirement to have this statement. There are, of course, criminal sanctions in lots of countries, but there are others that are now following our lead and looking at what they're going to be doing. In France, there's a vigilance bill. It has now had a second reading, and it will have a situation. If that goes through, then companies with over 5,000 employees in France or 10,000 globally will be required to make public a plan for tackling modern slavery in their businesses and in relation to their supply chain. So, and that will have a financial penalty, unlike ours. What's proposed is an up to €10 million fine for non-compliance. So France will be going, if that all goes through, further than we have. The Swiss government, the Swiss law is interesting because a lot of it can be changed by referendum of the people, provided that they get a petition. If you think about referenda recently, it's an interesting concept that once you get over 100,000 signatures, you've got to actually put a change in the law before the government. So, and that one, if that goes through, then multinational companies there, Swiss-based, will have to undertake human rights due diligence, so which is wider than just modern slavery, of course, as I've said. So that will be happening. In the Netherlands, there's been some movement, particularly in the textile sector, in relation to this area. Agreements signed by quite a lot of people work together to eliminate modern slavery within their supply chains. Interestingly, Qatar, now this you may, if you were cynical, say this is all to do with them having been awarded the World Cup, but there was a complaint by the International Labour Organization, and that will mean that they're looking at their kafala system. That's the system whereby they sponsor workers to only come to, they can only work if they're sponsored, and that is an area not only in Qatar but also in other areas of the Middle East. It's quite a problem, and I know somebody was speaking about that later. USA, what can I say about the USA as it stands at the moment? I think President Obama tried to get various things through. He couldn't. He did some work by executive order. The problem with executive order, of course, is that the next president can remove that on the basis of a countermanding executive order. He had to go by executive order because he couldn't get things through. So watch that space. Brazil, which used to have a government-backed, what was called the dirty list, those were people who had actually been convicted of using slave labour, they withdrew it around the time of the Olympics, which is a bit unfortunate. It's now being done by a non-government organisation, so it's still out there. You can still use it. What would I say about what organisations should be doing now? Looking at what your policies are in relation to this whole area. What I'm seeing people do is to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction, unfortunately, and to start to not actually conduct a proper risk assessment. I had one last week where I went and saw the in-house lawyer because he was concerned that it was taking up so much time of their organisation, because they mapped their whole supply chain and then sent this letter to everybody. to say, tick this, it's a tick box exercise really, send back the letter and say you haven't got any modern slaves, and then I can tick you off my list. And he called me in because BT hadn't replied. And what do? Do you say, well, I'm not going to have your telephones anymore? I mean, it's ludicrous. Not done any sort of risk assessment in relation to it. And this is a very large company. So it needs to be things which are kept in way, kept in I'm being asked to wind up here, which is distracting me. So review your due diligence processes, look at what contracts you've got. The problem with contracts is this, that whilst everybody's putting clauses in, how do you know who they're subcontracting to? Unless you've got something within your clauses that say you must identify who you're subcontracting to, you won't get anywhere, because then you run up against data protection and all sorts of things. So, it's another issue. Look at what you've got in the way of policies, whether you include this in any of your corporate social responsibility policies. Whistleblowing, amend that. Very important, train your people. Train your people to understand what this is about, because a lot of people don't understand it. They think it's only things that are abroad. Can they spot the signs? That type of training needs to happen. And then your audit regime. And all I would say when you do make these statements is, don't promise what you can't deliver. This should be a continuous improvement approach. It should be something which don't seek to put it all right in the first year statement, but a continuous improvement approach saying what you can deliver within that year will be much a better way to go. Thank you. I understand I'm late, so.